Welcome to the Machine Ethics Podcast. This month I'm joined by ethicist Susan Anderson and computer scientist Michael Anderson. While researching for machine ethics, I came across the Andersons as their website machinethics.com and their book Machine Ethics were both top of the list when it came to searching. They literally wrote the book on machine ethics, and it's fantastic to get them on the show this month. We talked about how it was terribly designed for ethics, getting started in machine ethics, and the lead up to starting that endeavour, thinking about the best way of creating ethics and not relying on everyone's contradictory social stances. Big data isn't necessarily the answer to AI ethics. Is ethics even computable? Prima factor duties? Ethics, UI design, AI, and AI in the future of humanity. This is probably the best episode so far, so I hope you enjoy. You can also find us on machine-ethics.net or support us on Patreon, patreon.com/machineethics. Thanks very much. When I started talking about machine ethics and the ethics of technology, because I was interested in newfangled things like IoT and blockchain and things which were coming in at the time. This was 3 years ago. I was asked to do a talk at Digital Shoreditch, which is a festival in London, about IoT, and I proposed this thing about security and kind of surrounding putting connected devices in your homes. So I went and researched it, and everyone I talked to had much more interesting things to say about the social impact, the behavioral impact, the societal impact of these technologies, which is when I started flipping the talk idea from IoT, security, data, to essentially this title, Machine Ethics, and talking about the world of ethics to do with technology, and then moving into producing this podcast, which we're listening to now, hopefully. So that's a bit of background about that. And in doing that research, I came across your book. So if you could give us a little bit of background and let us know who's on the call, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, I'm Susan Anderson. I am a professor emerita of philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And in recent years, I have specialized in applied ethics, taught a number of courses like ethical issues in healthcare, and this is what has led to a research project with my husband.
Yep.
I'm Michael Anderson. I am a professor of computer science at the University of Hartford. I just recently quit my job. I guess they call it retirement, but I don't feel retired. And we've been working together, my wife and I, on this concept of machine ethics since about the turn of the century.
Yes, it's been a long time.
Yes, and you've obviously got the Machine Ethics book, which in its title is kind of, it seems like the coming out of this subject, in my appreciation. It's the start of something, a dialogue about, quite specifically, about AI and how we implement these systems and how that can affect us. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. What's interesting is that when this all started for us, I was looking at a book on 2001, the making of 2001, and we noticed that HAL was terribly designed as far as the ethics were concerned. And so I realized, being married to an ethicist and having an AI background, that maybe we had something to say about this, and it was time to start thinking about it, because HAL really wasn't that far away, at least some of its capabilities. So I went on the internet to see what kind of work has been done, and I said, gee, so what do I Google? What the heck should it be? I mean, how do I check to see? And I thought about what it could be, and in the back of my mind, I had remembered early AI research called machine translation, which was having to do with translating Russian to English and back. And somehow that always appealed to me, so I tried machine ethics to see what would happen. Well, I got 0 hits.
Sure.
So it was amazing. This was like 2003 or maybe even 2. Around that time. Yeah. So I was aghast that I found nothing, and simultaneously somewhat pleased that it was an open field to begin research in. So we started to work. Like later on, I discovered I did not coin the term. I thought I had, but I think we probably put it into popular parlance.
Yes. Yeah.
But there had been. I remember Mitch Waldrop was one that came up eventually in 1987. He had mentioned that term briefly in an AI magazine article about machine ethics, but he didn't call it that. He just used that term in the paper.
Yeah. And that work led to the book, I guess, which is Cambridge Press.
Yeah, but
actually, there were a number of steps in between.
Sure.
Michael put together a conference that we organized. I'll let Michael continue with what all that led to.
Right. Well, we contacted NSF about it as well, and they seemed to be said, that though it sounds a bit like science fiction, it does seem like that something should be started on this project. So we got some funding, and we put together I think it was a AAAI symposium on machine ethics, and I think that was 2005.
Yeah.
In which many of the people that you hear about, Jim Moore and just Gorini and Summer Bringjord. I mean, these names that come up frequently, Wendell Wallach, Colin Allen, that they were all it all came together at that particular symposium in Washington, D.C. at the time. From that, a special issue, IEEE Intelligent Systems came out about machine ethics that had those papers revised and published. And then from there, we did some more work, but Cambridge University Press contacted us about turning all that into a book. I think after we had our AI magazine article that we had done.
Right, we were invited to write that,
Yeah.
which was nice. And
so from there, the book
and
invitation
the Scientific
came.
American.
Yeah, I guess there's
before.
I'm getting it's just it's starting to fumble up in my mind exactly the actual timeline here. But eventually, Cambridge approached us. Well, it was funny at the time. I thought it was too early for this book. There was stuff, but what didn't seem like it was fully baked enough to do it. And so we we had a back and forth for a while, and then they finally convinced us it was worthwhile. And I think it was in the long run.
Because in my mind, it's almost kicking off this new invigorated. It's at a time, the beginning of the neural nets and deep learning situation and big data and all these buzzwords were starting to come in at that time, and people were starting to get hands-on with these things. And now you can't go. And we were talking about startups before. There's a startup for everything plus AI now. Yeah,
you mean you're just talking about AI in general?
Yes.
That somehow there's been a new resurgence. I mean, when I was in grad school in the early '80s, there was a big resurgence as well that finally failed. I mean, I guess maybe it started a little sooner than that.
Yeah.
And there was this great AI winter. That's when I was actually studying, was during the winter, and here it is again, summer.
Yeah.
But I think. And it's only because it's had this particular resurgence of the big data and neural net learning has had some pretty interesting success. I think one must be wary, though, that I don't think it's the panacea that is going to solve all of AI. I know one problem in particular that I don't see big data working for. It doesn't work for problems that don't have a lot of data, and that's our problem. We don't have a lot of data when it comes to trying to come up with principles for machines.
Yeah, sure, and that comes back to the ethics side
Or we
again.
do, but Or we do have data, but it isn't what we want. We're not trying to capture ordinary people's values, and
Or are we?
it's important to. No, we're not.
Okay.
We're not
Yeah.
because for one thing, you just get a bunch of contradictory stuff.
Yes, sure.
And I think as we're discovering in our country now, sadly, when you bring everybody in, it sort of sinks to the lowest common denominator, which from the point of view of an ethicist is just not what we think of ethics as being.
I just had this thought this morning. I was thinking about big data, and that is one of the big ethical problems now is that they notice when you use machine learning on raw data like that you get the prejudices and the discriminatory attitudes of humans embedded into that learned response.
Yes, yeah.
And they're trying to find ways to get rid of that. But now, on the other side of the coin, machine ethicists and at some level are thinking about doing exactly that, using the big raw data to determine ethics. And it's just a funny dichotomy here where you've got this problem on one side, and the other side thinks it's a solution. And I don't think it is a solution. Bottom line is, I think the best you can do is to cherry pick the data you're going to have to make sure you don't have those bad quote unquote values. But once you do cherry pick the values, you have decided the values, and you can't avoid making those kind of value judgments. And I think we need to make those value judgments at a higher level than raw data from humanity or academic computer scientists, social scientists. I think we need experts who've been studying the centuries of ethical knowledge of all their lives, ethicists.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
from my perspective, I think the big problem is that the majority of people who are working on this, the AI people in particular, have adopted a social science perspective. And that is not going to capture ethics. That is not going to represent ethics. Ethics is not a summary of the values that people happen to have, but it's the values they ought to have. And there has been a discipline within philosophy for centuries that has studied ethics, and I think there is an expertise that has come from this, and for some reason AI people do not want to tap into this expertise.
So do you think you're alluding that there might be a correct path or a silver bullet or something that we can start using to direct our effort into a more worthwhile direction? Is that kind of what you're trying to say, or you have some research on?
That's what ethicists do. I mean, that is the whole point of ethics. I'm not sure why Susan's having me speak right this moment. You tell him, Susan.
Okay, but I think an important point needs to be made, and it's part of the reason why I think people don't turn to ethicists.
Yeah.
They think that if ethicists have the answers, then they should be able to come up with the correct judgment for every possible ethical dilemma that might arise. Sure. And they start throwing out, some of the toughest cases, but they're not the sort of things that we want machines involved in doing. So to dismiss ethicists' involvement in this project because they don't have all the answers is to miss the opportunity of harnessing what has been learned in the study of ethics that can be applied to the sort of machines that we do want interacting with human beings. Michael points out a new perspective that I have been touting that we have that reminds me of the perspective of the ethicist John Rawls in the 20th century, last century now, who said that we should come up with the principles of justice behind what he called a veil of ignorance, where we wouldn't know what our positions would turn out to be in life. Yeah. So we wouldn't tend to favor, what would advance our positions.
Do you mind just... Sorry, I don't know if everyone would know that thought experiment. Would you mind outlining it really quickly?
Well, that's basically all it is that you attempt to decide what the principles of justice should be if you don't know who you're going to be in society. You're not going to know what sort of talents you have, whether you're going to be rich or poor. And so you probably would want to protect the lowest guy on the totem pole because it could end up being you.
Yeah.
So it did lead to a very different ethic from the sort of ethics that people had been championing when they have tried to advance their own positions. Okay, so I think we have the opportunity with machine ethics to adopt a similar, more neutral perspective, and that is we're trying to think about how we want machines to treat us. Okay, so not how we want to treat things, but how we want machines to treat us. And I think we're going to find there's an awful lot of commonality there. We want them to treat us with respect, not harm us. So I think that, for people who argue that there is no such thing as ethics, and we get told this all the time, that there's just different people. Yeah, it's shocking.
Sure.
There's just different people's ideas of right and wrong, and they're all over the place. I think we're going to find a lot of common ground, at least I hope so. And I think that ethicists can help to sort this all out.
Do you, I totally agree, for sure. I think there's a lot of knowledge there, and why would we not be using it? Carrying on from kind of ethics and then using the utility of ethics, I guess, is there's a lot of similarly in this kind of relativistic. Yes. Sorry, tongue-tied. There's also a talk that ethics or moral judgment making maybe couldn't be computable or is incompatible with programmed systems. I was wondering if you could comment on that sort of thing.
Okay, so we began exploring the idea of making ethics computable with a well-known ethical theory that has that at its heart, and that is utilitarianism, developed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, where they argued that in any situation, the right action is the action which is likely to lead to the greatest net good, so subtracting possible harms from goods. Considering all the alternative actions open to you and all of the people who would be affected by those actions. It's a natural place to begin computing ethics. And we actually developed a little program that we called Jeremy where we did this in a fairly simplistic way, but just to show that it was possible. But, of course, from an ethicist's perspective, utilitarianism is not the ideal ethical theory. It misses such things as what people deserve, what is just. It presumably, if it could be done without it being known, it could justify, say, harming one person to take all his organs to save 10 people. So actually killing somebody so that you could save 10 people. And if you imagine they're important 10 people and this could be done secretly, then it would seem that's the right action. But, of course, this is horrifying. So we don't think that utilitarianism has captured all of ethics, but it's an important part. I think any reasonable ethic is going to be interested in possible good results and harm that could result. And interestingly, the person who championed the basic perspective that we've adopted, W.D. Ross from your country, yes, he took an approach to ethics called the prima facie duty approach. Rather than having a single absolute duty to tell us what is right and wrong, he said the reason why ethics is so complicated is because it involves juggling a number of duties, none of which are absolute. And good that could result, harm that could result were a couple of his examples that he thought should be separated. You don't just subtract one from the other. In some situations, the one should be paramount. In other situations, the other one. So I have been fascinated by his approach for a long time and taught it in my introductory ethics course for many years. But the big problem with his prima facie duty approach to ethics is that it doesn't have a decision principle. So if none of the duties are absolute, if there's no hierarchy that you can appeal to determine the right action, the one highest on the hierarchy is what you go with, how do you decide? And certainly if we're talking about putting ethics into a machine, we have to have a decision principle. So this is where I turned to Michael and said, "Can you help me with this? My students have been unable to come up with a good answer. Do you think AI could somehow help us when there's no hierarchy?" So Michael, take it over.
I will in a moment. I think that you did a good job of describing how we are actually putting ethics into a computer. But I am not sure you answered Ben's question about relativity, but relativistic. Can you? I put you on the spot here. I mean that was the whole.
Well, I think I did initially when I talked about how, from a sociological perspective, you can certainly argue that different people have different values, different cultures have different values. That's been well known and discussed, even in the field of ethics. Sociological relativism or an individual relativism. But ethics is not, again, about the values that people happen to have, but the values that they ought to have. We have to think deeper than that. So I think, and most ethicists believe, that in an ethical dispute, there is a correct answer, but that doesn't mean that we have all the answers now. It is a field that is constantly developing, and we are coming up with more and more answers. At one point, slavery was considered perfectly acceptable.
Sure. I think
right.
This leads me on to a really
now not.
Good question, which you could probably both field, actually, with kind of dogmatic systems. So what you're saying there is how ethics change and how our culture moves on and things become permissible or not, as the case may be. And
right.
You were saying obviously about slavery and there's many other examples of this, women having the vote in England and things like that.
Right.
Do you think embedding ethics, whether it's utilitarianism or the kind of this maybe tree-structured duty system that you were talking about before, or you're saying there was a lack of structure, but the duty system would inherently have a dogmatic issue embedded in it if it was not updated constantly or checked in with?
Of course, we believe that ethics is evolving, and we've always said that if the ethics isn't clear for how a machine should behave in a particular domain, we don't want machines out there acting autonomously and making decisions. So that's always been something that we have insisted on, although people aren't always getting that message.
Yeah, but it should definitely be updatable. And our system is updatable, which is the interesting thing. The answer to Susan's question, can AI help? And I was, it could, because we have this, right? We got this machine learning stuff here that is just perfect what you're talking about. If you can give me a number of cases in which you can describe what the ethically correct action is, I can give you a principle that will return true in that particular instance, return false when you have the opposite instance, and if I make it general enough, even apply to cases that you haven't given me. So we were right on it was perfect. After doing the utilitarian version, it was great to have a brand new perspective that she had to move this project forward. And that's where it's been. That's what we've been working on. We started off with a simple system using 3 duties in the domain of
biomedical ethics, because I had some background in that. And the ethics is fairly clear. It's resolved pretty much.
So we worked on that, but we did all that by hand, and it was like a hand tool AI is pretty difficult to pull off. Sure. But we managed it, and we managed to come up with this principle that, given just a few, I can't remember the numbers, Susan has the numbers done better than I do, but a few cases, was able to answer all the cases within that particular domain in those those duties correctly. So we said we were on the right track. But it was so difficult to try to hand tool this thing step by step that we needed a tool, and that's where we started. We got another grant from NSF to build what we call GenEth, this tool that allows us to do the kinds of things that we were doing by hand, but in a much grander sense.
If I can interrupt here, I think that people would be interested in exactly how we represent ethics. And it occurred to me, actually, after a couple of years working on this, that the important thing that we have to establish first is the ethically relevant features of a dilemma that we might encounter.
Right. Yeah.
So they may be such things as causes harm, leads to good, respects the autonomy of the patient if we're in the area of biomedical ethics. Yeah. And then it occurred to me that hooking this up with prima facie duties, so for every ethically relevant feature, it's either something which we want to maximize or minimize. Mm-hmm. So good consequences is something that we want to maximize, harm is something we want to minimize. And so we're able to tease out these prima facie duties and then work on the problem of how to resolve conflicts among them. Now, we also had to represent each one in terms of a number, of course, if we're talking about a machine.
Yep.
And one of the misconceptions I think people have is that we would have to numerically represent exactly how much good or harm. 102 versus 96 or something like this, which of course would be impossible. But from the ethicist's perspective, we only have to represent differences in terms of the intensity of the features and duties involved insofar as it makes a difference ethically. And so we found, for the most part so far in our work, just having a somewhat satisfies or violates versus, sorry, I hit the microphone, versus, give me the word, Michael, greatly satisfies or violates a duty, that's about all we need.
Yeah. So you can compress that information down because it's too unwieldy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So we only expand the numbers, which represent the intensity of the satisfaction or violation when it's needed. So if a new case is given that is a case where we can't represent the difference between this case and an earlier case, it may very well be because we need a wider range of intensity. Or it could be, and this was something I found in earlier research with students on my end, there may be an ethically relevant feature we haven't hit on yet that's in this case and was not in the earlier case, and a new prima facie duty. But these prima facie duties do end up being within a particular domain, limited enough to work with. So that's another thing you may think, we're just going to have thousands of duties. Yeah. But that's really not the case in terms of what's ethically relevant.
Yeah, because you have to remember what the domain is. I mean, we're talking about machines, autonomous machines working with human beings in some fairly benign situation. But that said, we believe every interaction that this machine has with a human being does have some sort of ethical ramification.
And not even interaction. So whether it should go back and charge itself or not is ethically significant, because if it has an important task coming up and it's low on power, then it may need to make that a very high priority.
Yeah. Or showing misinformation, or not showing information, or all these different things, I guess.
I can't think of anything that the robot does that doesn't have some sort of ethical ramification, because if it's doing something, it's not doing something else,
right?
At the very least, and
yes.
So that really is the bottom line. And when you start thinking of it that way, instead of the way people push these things to, well, how is this going to apply to abortion? Or, I mean, this is not really our task.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? We're doing something much more constrained. And I do believe that it does have, it is relative. Yes, it does relate. There we go. It does relate to the larger notion of ethics, but we start someplace where we can get some traction, so that we don't have a startup that fails. Right?
Yes, sure, yeah.
So the bottom line is, right now where we stand, after we've had this tool that allows us to build these much more complex principles with many more features and many more intensities, and to be able to take many more cases, because it's not hand-tooled any longer, we now have gotten to the point where we have a principle that we are using to control all the behaviors of a robot in an elder care situation. Right. That's our most current work. And we're working with a roboticist, Vincent Behrens, at the Max Planck Institute, who is, as we speak, finalizing these behaviors for the robot. And we're waiting with bated breath to see that what we did in simulation, which was actually control a bunch of dots that were being controlled by the same robot operating system, but controlling this robot dot in its robot dot situation with an ethical principle for all of its duties. We're now at the point within days of having an actual robot do it on a table, the Now robot, and then after that we have a Pal Tiago robot that's floor-based on wheels, but it's much more capable than the Now robot, and tried to put him in the lab. And then if we can find somebody who will take on the research board responsibilities, so that if we don't, they will tell us what to do. If we don't want to poke somebody's eye out. Sure. Moving it into an elder care facility and testing it out there as well.
Amazing.
Yes.
Great.
I'd like to mention one other point that I think is important, and that is that ethics is not about only what we ought not to do. And I think people who've thought about ethics in connection with machines, people actually creating them, have only gone that far, trying to block certain behavior. But really, ethics is about what you ought to do in any situation, not just what you ought not to do. And this is why any action of a robot that is interacting with human beings has, ethical dimensions to it.
That all came to me when I was when we first started out, and I was trying to figure out, when should the system kick in? Yeah. When do I know I'm in an ethical situation? And as I sat there and thought about it, I said, I don't know. And then I realized I always am. It's always there. And that was an epiphany.
So it should be controlling or have some say in all the actions of some sort of system. It drives the entire behavior of the robot at this point. That's what we're doing. Yeah. Right. So it's almost like it's instead of being a thing to add in afterwards, it's a thing which is the brain and represents the action.
Absolutely.
It is. It's the behavior control system right from the beginning. Yep. If you don't do that, then you have to sort of undo everything and start asking yourself questions like, what are the ethically relevant features involved here in this particular action, and it becomes very difficult in an ad hoc way to determine what you're supposed to do in all these situations, which is why we advocate a principle.
Okay, why it's good that we have a principle, and also something else Michael has built into the way we go about doing this work, and that is the machine can justify its behavior at any time. And we think that is really important. If somebody isn't sure that the machine did the right thing, okay, well, here's the principle guiding the behavior and the clause of that principle that led to this particular decision, and the cases that were used to come up with this particular clause of the principle. So we can go back to those cases and see, oh, yeah, I now see why this is what the machine should do in this particular case.
Yeah.
Or maybe we're not happy with that case and we want to introduce new cases.
Because I think this is a bit of, well, like you were saying previously, it's a bit of a departure, that the work that you're doing, from a more data-centric view that some people might have of deriving ethics from the data. What you're doing, if I'm not getting this wrong, is it's more of a utilitarian equation that you're building in, and then you can interrogate, because you've got this equation. You run it at that particular point in time.
It's actually a logical statement.
Yeah.
It's a predicate that you give it to. I mean, at the bottom line, you give it two actions. Mm-hmm. You say, is this action in this particular situation? And the situation is all again, I can't. There's just too much detail. A couple of actions, and you say, is this action ethically preferable to this action?
Yeah.
And you run it through the predicate, and it returns true or it returns false. It's just that simple.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, what dawned on me when I had such a piece of code that would do that thing, I realized I had the underlying comparative predicate required to sort actions, and that's when I realized we really could use this to drive behavior. So what happens is you have all the possible actions that a robot can do set there. You get the data from the sensors from the robot, and you fill up for each of the actions all of the values for how that particular action is satisfying or violating all the possible duties that this robot's involved.
Yeah.
So you get this big matrix full of numbers, so each action is actually represented by a list of numbers having to do with these satisfaction violation values. Then you use the principle to go through that list of actions represented like that, returning true and false as to which one is ethically preferable to the next, and you can sort the actions in order of ethical preference. Take the top one, do it, and that happens 100 times a second.
Yeah.
Is what goes on. So that if the situation changes and the robot's in the middle of doing something with Vincent's magical control system that allows interruptible behavior like that, we can stop what we're doing and continue on starting something else. And again, hundreds of times a second, or 100 times a second rather. And then when we're done doing that, we can come back to where we were before and continue on which was ethically preferable the last time we picked our action to do. So it was again another epiphany to realize that you could sort actions to choose the ethically preferable action at any given moment, and that could be used to drive all the behaviors of the robot.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what I was looking for. To function as a decision procedure when using a multiple prima facie duty approach to ethics. So I've been very happy. And I do think this is another thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, that we are going to advance the field of ethics with this work.
Yes, sure.
Okay. Right. We're going to come up with principles that have never been stated before, because keeping in mind so much data was sort of impossible for the human being alone. We're also going to settle on the ethically relevant features that is the ultimate linchpin of this whole approach. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm hoping, because of this new perspective of thinking about how machines should treat us, we are going to come up with some principles of ethics that I think at least all rational people should be able to accept.
Yes, yes. So
and I've argued that there is a sort of economic thing that could be driving this as well. So, as somebody who's attempted to actually start up a business, because businesses these days tend to be global, right? Very few are just centered in one particular culture and not interested in how it would apply to anyone else. So because of the global aspect of the development of machines, they're going to want some principles of ethics that people worldwide can accept. And this is why this work, I think, is really important and could lead to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. It's actually come up quite a few times during the podcast that the work that yourselves and others are doing you might find that there are universalities which keep cropping up in your systems or your algorithms that actually are distinct, and you can write them down, and they're things which like you were saying before, things that we should be doing, or almost morals that are inherent in the system, which we can't necessarily see.
And one last thing that this is my little pie in the sky dream of this work. I think that human beings interacting with machines that behave in an ethically proper way can maybe learn to become more ethical themselves. I envision in particular robots like Little Now interacting with young children and teaching them some basic values. Maybe we'll head off some of the terrible behavior that adult humans have exhibited in our history. Who knows?
Yes, well, hopefully robots will have less individuality to drive them, I think, which can only be a good thing.
Yes.
In my opinion.
If what you mean by that is biases of individuals.
Yes, biases of doing drugs and drinking and having nepotism and all these sorts of things, which won't necessarily feature, I'm hoping, or feature less. Do you think
exactly?
I mean, I could talk to you guys about this for hours. Have you got a few more questions in you? How are we doing for time?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay,
so we
cool.
don't break into our lunch.
Yeah, sorry, no, I won't do that.
No, we're fine. It's early.
Okay, great. So I've got, like I said, I've got lots of questions. One of the things which struck me there is you guys are obviously make it sound easy, and it must have been a lot of work and to get to the point you're at now. So it sounds fantastic and really interesting. And
But that was the whole thing originally, was like, we better get started now, even though at first we were looked upon. It's odd now. You couldn't find anybody doing any of this research. You couldn't find conferences who were interested in it. You couldn't talk to AI people without them rolling their eyes and saying it was unnecessary.
Yeah,
that was what we faced originally. But we are now at the point that we're actually doing this, and we're at the point where I thought we would be, actually sooner than I thought, where it is necessary and it is important, and people do see it, and we're hoping that these answers are going to help stave off the Luddite response to AI and try to shut down the entire project because they're afraid of the terrible possible consequences. Maybe the ethics will help quell that.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, you've probably already answered this question, but I guess you don't read too much into things like that are being said from Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking about the existential risk of AI and our future?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. I mean, nobody really knows what's going to happen with all this. I mean, the future remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But it's unfortunate that in a time where there's so much positive that could happen, to shut down because of this nebulous possible future world negative, that it seems unnecessarily alarmist. I'll give it that, unnecessarily alarmist.
And I have a perspective. Again, I think it comes back to this social science perspective, that people think that we're going to be developing machines that mimic human behavior. Well, we don't want to do that because you've mentioned some of the things that humans have done. They've behaved very badly. So we don't want to build into these machines the sort of qualities that are very destructive in humans and that may have evolved as a result of natural selection to make sure that we win out over other forms of life.
Yeah.
So, they seem to, what they're ultimately worried about, from my perspective, is that they will be so selfish that they will promote their interests over human interests. Well, why would we build selfishness into machines? We certainly shouldn't do that.
Yeah. I mean,
so yeah.
That's my project I've been working on at the moment, to make ethically malign, self-serving robots which only reproduce, and that's all they do.
This is your project?
Yes.
This is your project.
What did you say? Say this.
No, I'm obviously kidding. Don't worry.
Oh, okay.
Yes, a little sarcasm there.
Yes, that's the English sarcasm coming through.
Oh, I got it.
Yeah. But
So I mean, we want to proceed with care.
Yes.
I think that's fair. I think all technologies should proceed with care. We've seen many examples where you rush forward before the ethics are clear, and you pay for that. Well, we're saying let's not rush forward. Let's only put machines where the ethics is clear, and make sure that they are well. And the machines themselves are well informed with those ethics.
Yeah. Do you think this is, some of the work that you've been doing is purely applicable to autonomous systems which have lots of feature, like you were saying with this feature set, so have larger feature sets. So you might find this ethical programming in a robot, but you may not find it in a diagnostic algorithm for doctors, or you might not find it in a image recognition system, for example. Where does the kind of ethics start coming in?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, but wait, if you're wondering about whether ordinary people or people in specialized positions that use machines would realize what the ethically relevant features are and make sure that they take them into account, I think that they don't necessarily. And again, this is why I think we want ethicists involved in this project, because ethicists are able to imagine. We've been trained to think about possible actions and possible situations that could result if we adopt a particular principle. And I don't think ordinary people have been trained to do this. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to see the ethically relevant features and make sure that they're taken into account over, say, somebody who's just an engineer who's creating a particular machine.
I think I understand your question. I think it has more to do with what kinds of systems do we believe require ethical guidance.
Yes, sure.
And it's right, and there's an easy answer to that. It just comes down to the systems that have effect on humans. And if you think about it, I think they all do. I think I'm answering the question as I go along here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That even this, we've been invited to a number of meetings for Internet 2 that's all about Internet of Things, and they're all very interested in, even in their small little sensors that are being placed around the world or the environment, that they are behaving in an ethically appropriate way. They may be simpler. It may be because if it's simpler behavior, you may be able to hardwire in the one or two ethically relevant features it deals with and have it balance that without having to have this grand, huge principle that we need for a fully autonomous system.
Yeah.
But if it has any kind of interaction with a human being in which it can negatively or positively affect that human being's life, well, I think ethics are involved. And so I think the answer to your question is I think everything is going to have that basic control.
Mm.
And I like when you just said, Michael, if it has an effect on humans. It doesn't necessarily have to interact with humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that I hadn't fully appreciated.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, if you took this to the nth degree,
Can you name a system that doesn't have an effect on a human? That's why we build them. Yeah. Even in the indirect effect. I mean, if you satellite going around Saturn and about to crash in and taking photographs, that has grand effect for humanity. And I'm not sure what the ethics are involved in that. I have no idea. But it just strikes me that we don't build things that have zero effect upon us.
Yeah. Right. I mean, as a builder of things myself, in my mind, I'm trying to kind of make a mental model of what we're talking about. And you could almost take it to the nth degree and say you're creating things, and actually they don't necessarily have to be sophisticated AI-driven systems to warrant some sort of tiny AI ethical system, which might be leveraging the actions that it has. Let's take a Nest Thermostat, and it has
exactly. That's what everybody loves those.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I find them slightly dubious myself, but it only has.
Well, I mean, in terms of talking about what ethics may be involved here, yes. I've heard this before, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, even just the ethics of showing people a UI or turning the thermostat on and off. I mean, you could hardwire certain interactions, but then actually, when the system's operating on its own volition, you could have something running it to be more useful, be like you're saying, be a better system almost, instead of a reactive do the best in the worst case scenario system, which is quite an interesting concept. I think it's true.
Yeah, but it's just sort of like being baked as we speak.
Yeah. Cool. So I've got 2 more questions, which I usually ask all my interviewees. In the future, what are you most excited about coming up on the horizon, whether it's to do with some of the work you're doing or some of the work that you're seeing from other people? And what are the things that are discouraging or scarier on the horizon coming up?
I think it is a bit scary. I have that one more readily at hand than the positive. A bit scary that AI seems to have been taken over by big data. It was interesting to note that I saw one symposium that was saying we want non-big data submissions. It has that same quality. It's a bit. It is not, like I said before, a silver bullet for all of AI. It's not going to solve all the problems. It's going to solve some interesting ones, and it already has.
Yeah.
So I'm a little concerned that is taking over, and to the point where it's hard to get anything else published. It's hard to get anything else funded.
Yep.
It's hard to get any jobs in them, which is going to put a damper or slow down progress in other parts of AI, which may not be as flashy or have as grand results as quickly, but are still important if you're really talking about a full AI project. So that's one of my concerns about where we stand now, where we might head.
Yeah.
On a positive note, it strikes me that I'll give you my pie in the sky, and it's pretty science fiction-y, and I don't even fully understand what I'm talking about when I say it, but it's nonetheless what drives me in some ways to do this research at all. And it has to do with the concept that this planet does not last forever, that if we want to have some portion of us survive, we need to get off the planet. But I'm not sure that our metabolisms, the body that happens, is so tied to this planet, can really exist out anywhere else. And I think that AI might prove to be the thing that is going, the vehicle, the vessel that is going to be able to permit what I consider the most important, the grandest thing that evolution has produced, and that's this consciousness, this intelligence that we have. And if we can somehow port that in all its glories and warts into some sort of system and move that from the planet. We've sort of in the same way that they moved data off the planet decades ago,
Yeah.
and have that out. I think there's somehow AI can be the panacea, or that's the wrong word. It can be the savior of what I think is probably the most important thing that we have to offer to the rest of the universe, whatever that even means. So it's very science fiction.
Yeah.
But it's very hopeful in my mind that somehow that AI has that quality of capability to it.
Yeah.
And from the perspective of an ethicist, I really loved an idea that I heard early on in our work at a conference that we attended, and I had him include something in our book, and I'm just forgetting his name. But he says we have the opportunity to create humans 2.0, to create entities that have all the positive qualities of human beings while eliminating the negative ones.
His name is Eric Dietrich. Is that big?
That's right, Eric Dietrich. And I love that idea. And I think that we need good role models for how we ought to behave, and we have a chance to create them.
Great. But no negatives from you, Susan.
Well...
Don't get her going.
Going on that, the negatives are that, as Michael says, people in the AI community just don't seem to appreciate what we're doing at all.
Right.
They either reject ethics altogether, or they adopt this social science perspective that, well, to the extent to which we have values at all, it's got to be just trying to capture the values people happen to have, even if they're horrible. So I get discouraged because there are so few ethicists involved in this work or appreciators of what people have done in the field of ethics.
Well, hopefully you've come to the right place.
Good.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all of your time. It's been almost 50-odd minutes now, so thank you very much for sitting down with me and doing this podcast.
It's been great fun.
Yes, it's been a wonderful discussion, better than a lot that we've had. We really appreciate
That's true.
Yes, the questions you've asked and the interaction that, has brought out what I think is important about our work. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just one last thing to leave the listeners with. If people want to find out about you, follow you, interact with you, how can they do that?
www.machineethics.com.